And officially, good evening and welcome. We're so glad you're here. Whether you've joined us for dozens of webinars like this, or this is your very first one, thanks for being here. Before we get to Monarchs, I just want to take just a minute to talk about why initiatives like this one matter to us. I hope we can all agree that something happens to a person when they spend real time in the natural world. A forest walk that started as exercise becomes something harder to name, quieter, more attentive, more alive perhaps. A child who watches a hawk circle overhead asks a question she wouldn't have thought to ask indoors. That shift from observer to someone who genuinely cares is what New Hampshire Audubon has been working towards since 1914. We believe people who experience the natural world become people who protect it. Everything we do is built around that belief. For those of you who are new to us, New Hampshire Audubon is a completely independent New Hampshire-based organization. No affiliation with National Audubon. No national office setting our agenda. We are supported entirely by members, donors, and volunteers who care about this state and what happens to it. Our work runs across 4 program areas. We connect people to nature through education, like school programs, nature day camp, and webinars like this one. We research and work to recover species in peril, from large raptors to small birds disappearing fastest. We manage roughly 10,000 acres of wildlife sanctuaries and conservation land throughout the state for habitat and recreation. And we advocate for sound environmental policy at the State House because the land and the creatures on it need a voice where decisions are made. None of this happens without the people on this call. If you're a member, a donor, or a volunteer, thank you. We simply could not achieve our charitable mission without you. If you're not yet connected and you'd like to be, I hope today gives you a reason to start. Our website has every option, from membership to volunteering, from sanctuary stewardship to ideas to implement in your own backyard. Which brings us to today. Few creatures make the case for experience it, then protect it, quite like the monarch butterfly, an amazing insect that travels thousands of miles on wings weighing less than a paperclip. Today, we're going to trace that journey with someone who studies it closely. But a few quick notes before we start. You're all muted. We can't see you because we're in a full webinar mode. I think we wouldn't have the bandwidth if everyone was on video, but we are glad you're here. If you have a question along the way, please use the Q&A button, not the chat, and we'll work through those questions at the end of the presentation. The chat is open too, though, as many of you have already found it, so feel free to use it to say hello, tell us where you're joining from, or share your own monarch sightings. This session is being recorded, and we'll send out the recording afterward, maybe early next week. This webinar is reaching as many people as it is because of partners who help spread the word. Our special thanks to the Harris Center for Conservation Education, Lower Shore Land Trust, Nature Groupie, Rewild Long Island, and UNH Cooperative Extension. I'd invite anyone from those organizations on the call to share a link or links to their respective organizations into the chat for folks to learn more about the great conservation work that you're doing. And thank you to everyone here who've already forwarded this invitation to a friend. You are part of that same chain of getting people outside and paying attention. And if you enjoyed today's talk, consider passing it along yourself when you receive the recording next week. Now, to our guide for today. Lindsay Hurley is a project biologist at New Hampshire Audubon, where she coordinates the organization's efforts to study monarch migration. She also leads Project Nighthawk, the Capital Area Butterfly Survey, and New Hampshire Audubon's urban pocket pollinator garden habitat work in Manchester. Lindsay's connection to New Hampshire Audubon actually goes back to middle school when she started volunteering with the organization in 2002. She's been a part of this organization most of her life. Beyond New Hampshire Audubon, Lindsay is the founder and lead bander at Black Mountain Banding Station in North Sutton, New Hampshire, where she contributes to long-term monitoring of breeding songbirds and northern saw-whet owl migration. And as she puts it, you can't get this nerd away from the birds. So please join me and welcome Lindsay Hurley.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that lovely introduction. And for entertaining us in the waiting period between when we started pouring into the webinar and when we actually got underway. It is an honor to be here with you all this evening to discuss the monarch migration research that we are undertaking here at New Hampshire Audubon. So without further ado, let's dive right into Butterflies Without Borders, how we track monarch migration here at New Hampshire Audubon for the good of this incredible and highly migratory butterfly species. So we all know the charismatic monarch butterfly. They are very striking with their orange, black, and white coloration, warning would-be predators that they're a toxic mouthful and really should not be messed with. They're also our third largest butterfly in North America. Only the giant swallowtail and the two-tailed swallowtail are larger. And they're also classic examples of metamorphosis that is widely taught in elementary schools across the continent. So in this webinar, we will discuss a brief review of the monarch life cycle and some of their habitat requirements for context. We will discuss the migratory nature of monarchs, conservation concerns related to monarch butterflies, and how we are studying monarch migration to inform conservation efforts, and finally, how you all can take action to support monarch conservation. You're all likely familiar with the general structure of the monarch life cycle, starting with the egg, through the larval stage as caterpillars, to the chrysalis where they pupate and develop into adults, where we more widely recognize them. But I'd like to take a quick moment to put this cycle in context with time. So mated adult female monarchs typically lay a total of 100 to 300 eggs. However, they'll usually only place a single egg on an individual milkweed plant, and it's thought that that is to reduce competition between her offspring. Eggs hatch about 3 to 5 days after laying, depending on temperature and weather conditions. Once they've hatched, the larva feeds voraciously on milkweed leaves, buds, and pods, usually only from the plant they hatched on, unless competition forces them to move to an adjacent plant. But it is important to note that these caterpillars consume only milkweed species. So as the monarch caterpillars are eating and growing, literally all they do for the first 9 to 14 days of their lives, they grow to nearly 2,000 times their original mass, all within a maximum of about 2 weeks. And like all insects, monarch caterpillars have an exoskeleton. So as they grow, they need to shed that rigid body covering in order to continue their development until the point where they pupate and create their chrysalis, which is a whole incredible process in and of itself, but a little outside the scope of this talk this evening. Once the monarchs emerge from their chrysalis and fully expand their wings, their exoskeleton will gradually harden. And unfortunately for the monarch, as an adult, their days are really numbered. For most of these adult monarchs, their only objective is to find a mate and start the next generation. And these reproductively active monarchs only live for about a month or maybe even a little bit less, except for a very special generation of adult monarchs that usually eclose or emerge in late summer or early fall. These monarchs are the ones who will migrate south to their non-breeding or overwintering grounds, most of which are located in Mexico. These monarchs, instead of seeking out a mate, enter reproductive diapause, which gives them the extra longevity that they need in order to complete their southbound migration. As I've mentioned previously, the sole source of food for all larval monarchs or monarch caterpillars is milkweed. We do have 7 species of native milkweed here in New Hampshire, although the last of which that's listed on the slide, purple milkweed, is state endangered. So we don't have very much of it left anymore. The majority of the milkweed that you see in the state is the most well-known or common milkweed, which is very aptly named. Adult monarchs, however, can feed on nectar from any blooming plant that they have access to. Some of their preferred native nectar-producing flowers include asters, coneflowers, daisies, which also includes Joe Pyeweed and ironweed, and goldenrods. Fall migration of these butterflies is an absolutely astounding feat of endurance and evolutionary development. It's important to note that there are 2 distinctive populations of monarchs here in the continental US. The western population isn't fully migratory. Some of them, even if they don't stay exactly on site year-round, will only undertake shorter migratory movements. So we will be focusing, for fairly obvious reasons, considering we are also New Hampshire Audubon, on the eastern population. For both of these populations, though, environmental cues such as sun angle and day length prompt the newly emerging adults in the fall to enter that state of reproductive diapause and begin flying in a southward direction. This eastern population of monarchs that we'll be focusing on travels approximately 3,000 miles south to Mexico in their Oyamel fir forests. And these forests are remarkable because they offer the perfect microclimate to help monarchs survive and thrive during the winter. It's cool enough there to lower their metabolism, but warm enough that they can't freeze. It's dry enough to minimize the growth of any pathogens that they might be carrying accidentally, but also humid enough that they can't dry out. Now, it's important to note that there is some research developing on a new set of overwintering grounds that monarchs are beginning to establish along the Gulf Coast of the US. And one thing that will be fascinating to see in this research moving forward is how many of our monarchs from this latitude up here in New Hampshire go all the way down to Mexico versus which ones stay along the Gulf Coast or in Florida. Now, northward migration begins in late winter. So around February, these monarchs will begin to make their way north again. However, they're no longer in reproductive diapause. And so just like the reproductive stage monarchs in other parts of the US in the height of the summer and later in the spring, their days are now numbered as well. And because of that, they need to make a multi-generational kind of leapfrog style northward migration, where the descendants of the original southbound migrants will go part of the way north, pause, mate, start the next generation, their offspring will continue, and even their offspring continue even further north. So by the time we start seeing monarchs here in New Hampshire, right around this time of year or a little bit earlier in late June, they are usually the third or fourth generation removed from the monarchs that we saw last fall when they migrated south. Now, these overwintering sites in the OML fir forests are absolutely astonishingly beautiful. And the gathering of monarchs in these OML fir forests is an awe-inspiring spectacle that has captured the hearts and imaginations of many people throughout North America, and even inspired cultural festivals honoring the monarch in some parts of North America. These massive congregations of butterflies provide one of the best ways to monitor long-term trends in the whole eastern population of monarch butterflies. And that is done by tracking how much land area in the OML fir forests are blanketed with these overwintering monarchs each year. Now, unfortunately, the data from these monitoring efforts has been showing a disturbing trend. We have seen widespread declines in the monarch population since the early 1990s. Both eastern and western populations that utilize different overwintering sites have declined by over 80% each. Because of these declines, they have been listed relatively recently as a vulnerable species by the IUCN. And there is currently a status review by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service to consider listing monarchs as an endangered species in the USA. But they are certainly a species of conservation need, including up here in New England. Threats that have been identified so far include habitat loss, both on their breeding grounds and in their overwintering grounds, pesticide use, and climate change. And while scientists have established some of these threats that monarchs are facing on their breeding and overwintering grounds, we still know relatively little about monarch migration and the threats that they face along that journey. But since migration is the most dangerous and one of the most energy expensive parts of the monarch life cycle, it's very important for us to study monarch migration and identify areas of conservation concern that they could be facing along their journey south and also back north in the spring. And this is where New Hampshire Audubon's monarch migration research can help to fill in some of the gaps in how our knowledge of the way that monarchs migrate. So we are hoping to find out what migration routes monarchs follow when they leave New England and head south to their overwintering grounds. We want to know how fast they can travel, what their flight trajectories are, and how far they can migrate on any one given day. We also want to know where these monarchs stop along their journey to rest and refuel. These are called stopover sites, and they're critically important for any migratory animal in order to eventually reach their destination in good health. We also want to know more about the how we study monarchs so that we can identify the best methods to do so. And that will be a key part of our conversation here in this webinar this evening. We also want to know how all of this data that we generate from these studies can be used to guide habitat enhancement efforts to help ensure that these monarchs can stick around for as long as possible. And finally, we also want to know how we can use these research efforts as an educational opportunity and to engage the broader community. So starting in 2019, with the development of the, at the time, smallest radio tracking device on the market, a company called Lowtech and a network called the Modus Wildlife Tracking Network have brought great new opportunities to track small animals like monarchs along their very long southbound flight. Prior to the development of these miniaturized radio tracking tags, everything that we know about monarch migration, including where they end up over the winter, was discovered using adhesive paper wing tag studies. And these wing tags have been used since the 1940s and have been incredibly valuable in helping us to learn what we know today about how monarchs migrate and where they go. These tags are ultra lightweight, easy to apply, and inexpensive, but they do have a few drawbacks. In order to learn anything about a monarch carrying a wind tag, it needs to be resighted or physically recovered after it's been released. And most of that happens at the wintering grounds, leaving this really large amount of land area mostly uncovered by this detection information. And on top of that, only about 1% of tagged butterflies are ever actually recovered. So for reference, that's roughly 15,000 recoveries for every 1.5 million of these adhesive wing tags deployed on butterflies. Again, they've given us great information, but they have some limitations. So in contrast, these nanopins, the tiny radio tracking devices from Lowtech, can give us a much higher rate of detection, including increased data precision, especially as they're on their way south during migration. However, they are relatively heavy compared to the mass of a single monarch butterfly carrying it. The tag itself weighs just barely over 1/10 of a gram, and it's put on a 1/2 gram butterfly at the lowest end of the scale. And these tags, because they're such cutting edge technology, are also relatively expensive, and they only have a very short battery life. Because if you think about it, in order to be able to put a tag on a small insect, one of the first things you're going to need to shrink down is the size of the battery, which in turn impacts the lifetime of the tag. Regardless of these limitations, butterflies are incredibly strong, both because of the physical external exoskeleton strength, but also in terms of their ability to carry these tags. And so they are still a very effective tool that can give us a lot more information about how monarchs get from point A to point B during their fall migration. To apply these low-tech nanopins, we of course first need to catch these monarchs during their fall migration by hand netting. Once we have the monarchs in hand, we hold them gently but firmly with the underside of their abdomen exposed. While we're holding on to them in this way, we take great care to avoid creating any friction between their wings and our fingers in order to preserve all of the scales that cover the monarch's wing to give them their aerodynamic nature, some of their structural stability, and all of their gorgeous coloration. When they're held in this secure manner, we are then able to apply a thin layer of glue to the tag and place it, again, gently but firmly, on the underside of the monarch's abdomen, way up close to where the insect's thorax and abdomen meet. Once that glue has cured, We keep an eye on the monarchs by observing them for roughly 30 minutes to ensure that they adjust to the tag. It is possible, although very challenging and delicate, to remove the tag if needed if the butterfly doesn't adjust. Luckily, I personally have never seen an instance where full tag removal is necessary. Sometimes we just need to adjust the fit a little bit to make sure that it is exactly where it belongs and it's not interfering in any way with the monarch's legs or wings. Once these butterflies have gone through their adjustment period, all of the tagged monarchs are released, and that is when the tracking begins. So once a tagged monarch is released, the activated nanopin that it's carrying sends out periodic pulses of radio waves, which are then detected by any MODIS receiving station that the monarch flies past. The, as we call it, detection radius is relatively small. So the monarch really needs to be within line of sight of the tower in order for its tag signal to be detected. Once the signal is picked up by receiving stations, however, they're uploaded to the MODIS Wildlife Tracking Network, which are then accessible at modis.org, both to researchers and to the general public. You all are actually able to go to the MODIS website and look up the species monarch and see all of the detection tracks that we are talking about for this project and for a couple of other research projects that have tagged monarchs in the past as well. And by connecting the dots that represent each a single detection of this monarch's tag as it flies by a receiving station, we are able to visualize the path taken by each of these tagged monarchs on their incredible journey south. So let's talk about what we've learned so far. Starting with our pilot year in 2021, we tagged 4 monarchs just to see proof of concept, make sure that they can carry these tags, that they transmit okay, and that we can learn enough to make it worthwhile to continue these tagging efforts. Sure enough, we learned a great deal from those initial 4 tagged monarchs. And so in 2022, tagging efforts began in earnest and continued up through last year when we welcomed 2 incredible researchers to join this project from Maryland and Kentucky, respectively. And that will allow us to get even more information from these monarchs, particularly given that the tag's battery life will only last for just under a month. Within this time frame, a little over half of the monarchs that we tagged on the coast of New Hampshire have been detected, and about 40% of the monarchs that we tagged in the Concord area have been detected. Now, this might not seem like a lot, but considering the resighting data for the monarch wing tags, which is 1% or less, this is excellent rate of detection for these tagged monarchs. So far, about the routes that monarchs are taking on their way from New England down to their overwintering sites, we've identified that there are 2 main pathways that these monarchs are traveling. Some monarchs hug the coast or the Atlantic seaboard as they travel south. Others take a slightly more inland route that follows the Appalachian Mountains. We have also noticed that weather can play a very significant role in shaping these routes in some years. In particular, the fall of 2024 had some strong sustained winds from the east. And we suspect that that is why all of our blue detection lines on this map, all of which are from 2024, showed monarchs following a much more westerly route than usual. But at some point, all of these monarchs, whether they're following the Atlantic seaboard or the Appalachian Mountains, are going to need to take a westerly turn in order to circumnavigate the Gulf of Mexico and arrive at their ultimate destination. Based on our tagging data so far, this westerly turn seems to begin right around the latitude of Maryland and Virginia. We've also learned a great deal about the distances that monarchs are traveling along this much larger route. The longest flight by a monarch that we've detected so far started in New Hampshire and was last detected at East River Mountain, and that borders Virginia and West Virginia. A total journey of 830 miles. Now, the Monarch very likely did continue on south after this, but that's where the battery of the tag that it was carrying died. And so, therefore, that's where we lost track of it at that point. We've also detected 3 separate monarchs in Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge in Maryland, which from their tagging location in New Hampshire is a flight distance of approximately 550 miles. And then again, lost track of the bugs because the battery on their tag died. And we also had a tagged monarch that flew from Concord, New Hampshire, down to Pomfret, Connecticut in 24 hours, which is really pushing the previously established maximum daily flight distance of about 80 miles that was previously recorded. This was pretty amazing. So far, the southernmost extent of our detections has been in Georgia. Overall, we've seen that many tagged monarchs from each of our cohorts from 2022 to 2025 follow the same approximate routes. And this consistency can really help us define the migratory route that monarchs follow and enhance conservation of the places that they need to stop along those routes to rest and refuel. And we've also learned from 2024 especially that prevailing winds can play a role in shaping these routes year to year, which does have implications more broadly for ways in which climate change could eventually impact the monarch's migration route as well. We're beginning to learn more about the types of locations that monarchs are using to rest and refuel along their journey, as well as we analyze where all of these monarchs are being detected. Most of the sites where monarchs are detected are either directly within or in close proximity to large grasslands and wetlands. These 2 in particular of these include Jamaica Bay and Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, each of which includes thousands of acres of potential nectaring resources. Most of the other sites where we're getting our monarch detections are also areas that are greater than 500 acres in size. This tagging effort has the potential to add to the knowledge of landscape use during migration as well. And efforts are currently underway to partner with organizations along monarch migration routes in order to enhance nectaring habitat for monarchs and other pollinators. but it's especially important for monarchs to make sure that they get adequate energy intake to fuel the remainder of their migration. And we hope that future research will investigate whether monarchs are able to use smaller patchwork-style habitats, as well as these larger tracts of continuous habitat that we've already observed them utilizing. And this is especially important because the Atlantic seaboard is highly urbanized, and that has drastically reduced nectaring opportunities for monarchs over time. So if they are able to shift and use these smaller landscapes, then we have very actionable and significantly easier to undertake methods to ensure that these monarchs have access to nectar resources along their entire migration route. So we've learned a great deal so far, just since our pilot study in 2021. But there's a lot left that we need to know. In particular, we want to continue our analysis of stopover habitat and start addressing what I just mentioned about these larger tracts of nectaring land versus these smaller patchwork habitats that we hope monarchs will also be able to utilize. And that will lead us into urban habitat enhancement efforts. And we are very, very lucky this year to have begun partnering with the Lower Shore Land Trust in Maryland and Rewild Long Island in New York to continue to ensure that these incredible migrating butterflies have plenty of resources to get them from point A to point B. And arguably the most exciting, starting this very September, we will be comparing a brand new type of tracking device, the CTT BluMorpho tag, to the tags that we've already been using by low-tech for the past several years. So let's talk a little bit about this new type of tag and how it compares to what's already on the market from low-tech. So as I mentioned previously, the nanopins by low-tech are relatively heavy compared to a monarch's total mass. So they weigh about 0.13 grams, and they're applied to monarchs that weigh at least 0.5 grams or greater. They do have a pretty high rate of detection, between 52 and 40%, and they rely on that network of MODIS receiving stations that I mentioned. But that does still create some gaps in our detection data. They are also relatively expensive, and they have a very short battery life of between 19 and 29 days. Now, you may notice right away that there's a big difference between the low-tech nanopin, which is shown attached to the butterfly on the left, and the BluMorpho tag that has been applied to the butterfly on the right. The low-tech nanopin can be applied on the underside of the monarch's abdomen. However, the BluMorpho tag has a tiny solar panel on it, and it has no battery at all. It's just that tiny solar panel and a capacitor inside of the tag. And that innovation is the biggest reason why the BluMorpho tag is much, much lighter weight than the low-tech nanopin. So the BluMorpho tags only weigh about 0.06 grams. That's less than a grain of rice, one single grain of rice. They also have, or are expected to have, a very high rate of detection because, in addition to utilizing the MODIS Wildlife Tracking Network, they are also Bluetooth capable. So any device, especially cell phones that are Bluetooth enabled, can act as mobile receiving stations for this new tag type, which is just a mind-blowing innovation that, in case you haven't noticed, I'm really excited about. And so that should give us even higher resolution of monarchs carrying these tags between us up here in New Hampshire and their overwintering grounds. Because we aren't dealing with a battery anymore and these tags have a solar panel, the thought is that they should also last for the monarch's entire southbound journey, rather than the battery life running out somewhere between Maryland and Georgia. Now, on the downside, because these tags are Bluetooth enabled, they do come with data charges on our end. It does not impact anyone that is using a cell phone app in order to track them. More on that later. But honestly, that small drawback sounds like it's going to be irrelevant, completely worth what we're hoping to get from these tags in terms of data resolution and also engagement with the community, because now we can all track these butterflies together. Because these CTT BluMorpho tags have the solar panel on the top surface of the tag, they have to be affixed to the top side of the Monarch, which means it's going to be a little bit of a learning curve for us this fall to get used to a new method of applying these tags. But we've been working with other researchers who have been absolutely fantastic in sharing information about their methods. And we know that we'll be able to safely hold the monarchs still with their wings opened using envelopes made of a substance called glassine. It's commonly used by coin collectors or stamp collectors. And it's a very smooth, gentle way to hold their wings still with a little bit of weight applied so that we can have the time and space we need to very carefully and precisely affix that tag right in between the joints for the monarch's wings. And in principle, these Bluetooth tags, the BluMorpho tags, work very similarly to the low-tech nanopins in that a released monarch with a tag has the tag send out periodic pulse frequencies. This particular pulse frequency, however, is Bluetooth compatible, which means that anyone with a Bluetooth-enabled cell phone in the area can pick up that monarch's tag signal, and that detection is then relayed to both the CTT interface, the makers of these tags, and it can also be uploaded to the Modus network as well. So now we have multiple different ways to visualize this monarch's route. I'm hoping that you all have become just as excited about these new tags as I have, because we need your help to track these tagged monarchs once fall migration begins in mid-September. So these two QR codes on the slide right now will take you to either the Apple Store or the Google Play Store to actually download a free app that will allow you to see these tagged monarchs in real time as they're released with their tag and they make their southbound journey. I will make sure that the link and or the QR code to allow you to download this app is made available once this webinar is over. So if you haven't had the chance to whip out your phone and scan the QR code yet, don't panic. I promise I'll make sure that everybody has access so that you can all become a part of the Monarch Tracking Network this fall. Scientists are still learning a lot about the many threats that monarchs are facing and how each of those threats is impacting monarch populations and fueling that decline that we discussed earlier in the webinar. These threats can be roughly placed into three categories, though. Habitat loss on both their breeding grounds up here and their overwintering grounds, and also likely happening along their migration route. Pesticide use and climate change, which can shift weather patterns and impact the distribution of the Oyamel fir forests in Mexico. As we've seen from 2024 data, if we see major shifts in wind patterns, it could impact their migratory routes as well. And it definitely impacts the blooming periods for different wildflowers, both the sprouting time of the milkweed that female monarchs lay their eggs on and that the caterpillars need to feed on, and for those mature flowers later in the season that the adult monarchs require to fuel their lives and their migration. And one thing to keep in mind, even though it sounds like the monarchs are in a really bleak place right now, you do have the power to alleviate some of these threats. The first advice I can give you in that regard is to plant native whenever you can. For those of you who might be interested in beautifying your yard, one thing to consider is reducing the amount of grassy lawn that you have in favor of a native plant meadow that provides resources not only for monarchs, but for hundreds of other species of native pollinating insects. If you already have a field as a part of your property, delaying your mowing in the fall to allow those nectar resources to remain available for migrating monarchs is a wonderful way to help support them during their migration. One other consideration is reducing or eliminating household insecticide use, because unfortunately, insecticides impact far more than just their intended target. Even a tiny amount of insecticide residue has the capability of making an insect unwell or outright killing it. And of course, you are also able to join some wonderful participatory science opportunities, including the Project Monarch app from the previous slide, to help monitor monarch migration and other aspects of their annual cycle as well. And if participatory science for monarchs is of particular interest to you, I've compiled well, actually not me in this case, this is to an external website. There are a wide variety of opportunities to engage in valuable science that will directly benefit monarch conservation as well. And this is yet another QR code. I understand not everybody may have whipped out their phone fast enough to get it. But again, this link will be provided to all of you after the webinar is concluded, so don't panic. We here at New Hampshire Audubon owe an incredible debt of thanks to the many wonderful and dedicated and highly skilled volunteers that have helped to make this research effort possible. And I know some of you are in the audience tonight. Thank you so much. And we hope to see you back again for this tagging season in September. We also owe thanks to the absolutely outstanding partners who have joined this project, including researchers Amy O'Donnell and Micah Perkins. Shout out to you, Micah. I know you're out there in the audience. Thank you for joining us, both for the research and this evening for the webinar. Also, thank you to the other participants of Project Monarch. You are wonderful, and we are very excited to be joining that collaboration this September. And thank you also to our habitat enhancement partners, the Lower Shore Land Trust and Rewild Long Island. Last but certainly far from least, we also have had a number of funding sources to make this research possible over the years. So huge thanks to these various organizations that have allowed us to do this very fun and very valuable research efforts. And at this point, thank you all so very much for being here this evening. If you have any questions, I am happy to field them at this time, and it appears that we have lots of time for them. So stick around for some fun conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lindsay. That was an incredible storytelling of the research and impact that we're having with so many different partners. Thank you for your leadership on this project. And yeah, there are a lot of questions, Lindsay. And thanks to Amira, who's been slowly answering some of them.
Hey, Amira!
I will look for one that hasn't been answered. And I don't know if this is too specific, but Nora asks, do oxeye daisies offer any food to monarchs or other native insects?
Short answer, yes. The native daisies that we have around here, any native aster family plant really, will also be an important host species for the larval forms of native pollinators as well. I unfortunately don't know immediately off the top of my head how proportionately how much nectar oxeye daisies offer monarchs and other adult pollinators, or which larval pollinator species might utilize oxeye daisies specifically as a host plant. But yeah, they are definitely valuable. And I think Diane DeLuca is in the audience somewhere. Diane, if you know that off the top of your head, by all means, please share.
Yeah, there is another option that I haven't talked about, but if you want to raise your hand and ask your question live, I think I can have an eye on the attendee list. And I think if someone raises their hand, they'll pop up to the top anyway.
Yes.
Moving on to a next question from Kirsten. Is there any research or estimate of the potential impact of invasive species like black swallowwort on monarchs' reproductive success?
Ooh, on their reproductive success specifically. I'm not aware of any published findings, but there is a participatory science project that is gathering data on the larval stage of monarchs, so monarch caterpillars, which is, of course, a major component of monarch reproductive success. And it does include, if I'm remembering correctly, and Amira, I know you know about this project as well, so feel free to jump in as needed. They are tracking not only how many monarch larvae are found in a particular study area, but also keeping an eye on the amount of milkweed in that area. And so the biggest threat I can see from an invasive like the one that you mentioned would be exclusion of important resources for monarchs, particularly as the females are on their way north and looking for a good place to lay their eggs. So that's a little bit indirect, and now my curiosity is piqued. I would like to look and see if anyone has published anything on that recently, because it's an excellent question.
Yeah. There's a question about timing, and I want to selfishly insert my question before these other timing. I looked it up. May 25th, just when our oh shoot, now I'm blanking on the name of these little purple flowers, were in bloom. We saw our first monarch.
Mm-hmm. It's pretty early, but
Is that
it's
the
not.
ones that are continuing north to
Yes.
Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island? Shout out to
Yeah.
you guys that are watching. Um, it just seemed so crazy to me.
Yeah. So we can see monarchs appearing in New Hampshire in late May. And they could breed in this area and then their offspring could continue north. Certainly, they've got plenty of time left in the spring and summer to accomplish that. In which case, the answer to your question is more or less yes.
Mm,
They're going to be continuing on. Um, but we start seeing far more of them in June.
mm.
And just in time for the capital area butterfly survey, we had a pretty solid number of monarchs on our survey, which happens in the fourth Saturday of July.
Awesome. And then it seems like Lori and Amira has this conversation about the timing of the garden caterpillars in the garden right now. And
Yes,
are those the ones that are going to be migrating?
probably, depending on the size of the caterpillars at this stage. But it's, well, we've still got a month, don't we? Hmm. Younger instar caterpillars, perhaps.
Okay.
Peak migration in the New England region is mid-September. So typically between I believe it's like the 12th to the 25th is when we have the greatest volume of
Mm-hmm.
butterflies moving through. That is not the full extent of the migration by any means.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got some big beefy caterpillars that are getting ready to pupate, they're pushing the earlier end of things. But because their life cycle can be completed fairly quickly in general, and even more quickly under warmer temperatures because they're
Mm-hmm.
ectotherms, it's theoretically possible that if you have a big beefy caterpillar that pupates almost immediately, they could still breed.
Cool. Nora has a question that got a upvote with a thumbs up.
Oh boy.
How do you define a stopover location? Are you
Mm,
assessing where they spend the night? They don't fly then. Then they
correct.
don't fly.
Yep, they definitely don't fly at night. They are diurnal migrants only. And so a stopover site, there's some nuance to that definition. So, in the most general of terms, it's any location that offers shelter and food resources for the migratory animal to rest and refuel. Now, for very small animals like monarch butterflies, they're going to need to refuel more frequently compared to, say, a migratory songbird that can go for an entire night at least in straight flight, no stopping at all to rest or refuel. Monarchs do not migrate like that. They do seem to stop periodically throughout the day. They may need to spend slightly longer at some sites, especially if there's some unfavorable weather conditions that keep them grounded. So that's another quirk of being a migratory insect versus a migratory bird. Yes, weather matters for both, but it matters extra when you're tiny and at the mercy of even relatively light winds. So, that being said, because there are limitations to the tagging technologies that have been available to us until recently, we don't know that much about monarch stopover behavior. And so I unfortunately can't fully answer your question, Nora, because we just don't have enough information yet.
Hmm.
but yet I feel like I'm a spokesperson for CTT at this point. And I don't say that throwing any shade at CTT. They're a great company. But I will say about the BluMorpho tags that we'll be trying out this fall, that is also one area that we may be able to explore in a little more detail, is how long are monarchs staying at different locations. And then we can look at each of those locations and try to make some inferences about why they're staying there.
Mm.
Are they staying there because they don't have a choice and that's what the weather is making them do? Are they staying there because it's a particularly nectar-rich area with tons of native flowers in bloom? Time and hopefully detection data should help us sort out the answer to that question more thoroughly.
Yeah, and Nora followed up. Do the Motus Tower detections give enough time points to show when a monarch has set down to rest or nectar? They're just trying to understand how we're able to say that most stopover sites have been over 500 acres
Gotcha.
in size.
Yes. So the low-tech tags that we've been utilizing on monarchs have a programmable, what's called signal frequency or pulse frequency. The tags that we've had the greatest success with, albeit it shortens their battery life, have a pulse frequency of 3 seconds. So that means once every 3 seconds, the tag is sending out that radio frequency signal that could then be picked up by any tower designed to receive that signal within range. Therefore, if you have a monarch that stays close enough to a tower to pick up many signal bursts, we can tell how long they're spending at that site. But the caveat is, because these tags are very small, they have a limited range in which that signal is fully detectable. So once that monarch is, we'll say, just for the sake of having a followable conversation, once that monarch is out of line of sight of that receiving station, there's a very good chance that its tag signal will no longer be able to make it to the receiving station. That means in order to say this monarch spent 3 days at this site, several things need to be true. The monarch's tag needs to still have battery life. It needs to be within sensing distance of the tower, and it's a bit of a toss-up. So one thing that I will say to more fully answer your question, though, Nora, is that we can see not only the total duration of how long any one receiving station has picked up the tag, but we can also see within that duration how many individual signal bursts were occurring. And all of that information combined is what helps us to infer when a monarch is spending an appreciable amount of time in a location, which then allows us to say, that is a stopover site. That monarch is staying there on purpose, and there's a reason for it.
And she makes one final point. The Motus Tower locations might be biasing those results.
Yes. Thank you, Nora. You're absolutely right. So you're more likely to intentionally put a Motus receiving station on existing conservation land than you are on the roof of some random civilian's house. That is absolutely true. And so, yes, our data set right now is biased to include areas where we do have a greater density of receiving stations.
And that's what's so cool about the BluMorpho tags, is because it disperses the receiving stations into more urbanized areas and backyards.
Exactly. So not only should we get increased precision overall, but we'll have less bias in the locations of those receiving areas. Now, will there still be some bias toward human-occupied areas in general? Yes, there will. But on the flip side, the eastern seaboard is heavily populous. And there are very few adult humans out there who don't have a Bluetooth capable device. So we're hoping that the bias will be significantly lessened once we can include those CTT tags in our analysis.
And thanks, Lindsay. Shout out to Diane DeLuca answering the question about oxeye daisy being a great nectar plant in the chat there, if you haven't seen that, as well as adding that black swallowwort is toxic to monarch larvae, and they
That's a good one.
cannot survive if the eggs are laid on that plant. And another shout out to Amira. You're answering all of the ones in the Q&A. It's hard to find a one that you haven't answered. But here's one from Doris. If we see a caterpillar, should we protect it in a butterfly house? Oh, she's answering it right now.
Love it. Let me just, you go, girl, Amira. You go.
Should we protect it and give it milkweed and a stick to form a chrysalis? They're thinking about birds and might want to pick them off. Amira says rearing can be a great learning and educational experience, but it does require good sanitary practices and not considered conservation. And she links some info from Monarch joint venture.
Yep.
So check it there.
And just for context, folks, for those of you who have not met Amira before or encountered her in the context of other Monarch-related shenanigans from New Hampshire Audubon, Amira is one of our very active tagging volunteers. And in her own right, she is a Monarch expert. She coordinates, well, not just coordinates, she runs the entire show for the Monarch Festival that will be happening in Belmont later this month, and you should definitely check it out. It's going to be an incredible event. I will also be there doing tagging demonstrations, so that's another incentive to come. But Amira has extensive experience in rearing monarchs, so you cannot ask for a better resource on the most effective and ethical practices for monarch rearing. So, Amira, I've said it before, but I'm going to say it again. Thank you for doing all that you do, and thank you also for jumping in to answer so many of these questions to make sure we have time for everyone. Super valuable.
Okay, I think I've seen a couple questions about cutting milkweed plants. And just to summarize, and correct me if I'm wrong, Lindsay and Amira, it seems like we should be cutting some of our milkweed back earlier, because if you're like me, I was like, oh sweet, this milkweed is so early, and it was like June, and now I don't have any, or it's like really old.
Yep.
Gross.
Yep. So there are two reasons why it's beneficial to cut back milkweed earlier in the season in particular. One reason is that when monarchs do arrive here on their leapfrog style journey back north, the females strongly prefer to lay eggs on young milkweed shoots because the older, fully mature leaves and other plant parts are too tough for the youngest of the lower instar larvae to easily chomp on. So by mowing part of your milkweed earlier in the season, you are providing those younger shoots, and by mowing, you are also prolonging the total amount of time that milkweed is going to be available on your property. So there's an immediately tangible reason to mow and a longer term reason as the season progresses to do that early mowing.
Yeah, early, not right now.
No, not right now. Please,
not right now, everyone. Leave your milkweed. Learn like me for next year. Amir says end of June, beginning of July would be nice.
Yep.
And thank you, Lori. I was wondering why my butterfly milkweed looked great last month, but now is all just seeds. I should have deadheaded it.
Deadheading is good too. Yep.
Hey.
And once it does go to seed, you can collect that seed if you want to expand your milkweed patch. Just make sure that you either plant the mature seed in the fall so that it can cold stratify, or you can manually cold stratify it in the freezer. Amira is a pro at this. She walked me through her entire process, and it's fascinating. But long story short, in order to effectively sprout, the milkweed does need to essentially experience winter weather. So that's what cold stratification is.
Excellent. I love starting plants from seed,
It's
especially
also a
the
great
butterfly
opportunity to
milkweed.
get kids involved.
Exactly. Get their hands dirty early.
Yep.
Okay, here's one for you, Lindsay, from Nina. Given concern about location of bird banding stations, is there similar concern for the monarchs? They continue. Will the new transmitters immediately send signals which might then reveal banding locations? So I think the question is
Oh, I
it
see what
are
you're
we
saying.
worried that
Mhm.
community scientists can find these tagged monarchs?
Mm.
I mean, I want them to. I want it. I want that, like the educational aspect of it. I don't know if.
I want them to be findable without it compromising the safety of any of the animals that we're studying.
Mm-hmm.
The vast majority of the monarchs that we release, especially if it's a little bit earlier in the afternoon, tend to resume their migration quite fast. Um, some of them will spiral up out of our hands several hundred feet in the air. Sometimes we lose sight of them, they're so high, and then they start streaming southward. If we release them a little bit later in the evening, they may roost. But when they do that, they're pretty high up in
Mm.
trees. So they would be safe from the interference of any well meaning but perhaps ill informed humans. Um, I don't have any major concerns about revealing our tagging locations, partly because one of them is already very publicly accessible. We net quite a few of our monarchs in some community gardens, and those community gardens are in very close proximity to the McLean Audubon Center. And I welcome the public to join us on some of these tagging days as a part of regular programming for New Hampshire Audubon. So the secret's kind of already out. And then our other tagging location is in a national wildlife refuge with restricted access. So could you encounter a tagged butterfly after it leaves? Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. You could. But at this point, I have no reason to fear for the butterfly's safety because people have the ability to find them. And I'm hoping that it will stay that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This might be our last question from Barbara. Milkweed can be toxic to pets. Is
Yes.
that a limitation to helping monarchs?
Hmm.
Otherwise, or another way to ask the same question, I think, is if I have pets, what can I do for helping monarchs?
Totally. So, planting milkweed is a wonderful way to provide monarchs with resources, but it's far from the only plants that monarchs need to survive. While it is critical for larval monarchs because they only feed on milkweed, adult monarchs feed on any nectar producing flower that is in bloom at the time that they're flying. And fall nectar resources are particularly valuable for adult monarchs that are migrating south. So, if you are hesitant to grow milkweed, planting any other native flower and nectar producing plant will be helpful. If you choose to go that route, we tend to recommend, especially if you're thinking of an actual like flower garden or pollinator garden, do your best to keep the plant diversity as high as possible. that will also help with natural pest control. So double benefit there. But that will also allow you to choose plants that bloom throughout the entirety of the growing season, thereby providing nectar resources at all times that you could have monarchs visiting your property. So even those monarchs that are not in reproductive diapause that are coming back to New Hampshire or even maturing in New Hampshire earlier in the summer, they still need nectar too. So you can grow other things besides milkweed. If you do want to grow milkweed, enclose it so that so that your pets can't get it.
It's late. It's late, Lindsay.
Yeah.
So your pets can't get it. So yeah, I saw Carrie add to the conversation about seeing a caterpillar, letting it do its thing on the milkweed instead of taking the chrysalis. And yeah, I think they write, so conservation considered the building and protection of habitat rather than increasing the number of butterflies hatched. So I just want to see that, and I think answer for us, like that's what we have control over.
Yep.
That honestly, there's another benefit, like that's what brings a lot of people a lot of joy, seeing beautiful blooms throughout the season as well. So there's like that twofold benefit. And yeah, I don't think that we're going to be. It's not in Audubon's strategic priorities to rear more butterflies, but rather engage folks in this conservation work to build out that patchwork of supporting habitats.
Absolutely. And the tagline that we use when we talk about pollinator habitat enhancement, not just monarchs, because anything that you're planting for monarchs is also going to benefit other native pollinators. But the tagline is build it and they will come. If you provide the resources for them to thrive and you do your best to minimize human behaviors that could be harmful to them, then they can recover on their own. They just need the resources and the physical space and less interference to do so. So the only reason that we are tagging these butterflies, which is, if you think about it in the bigger picture, it is a relatively invasive process. Think about if a giant 100 times your size snatched you up in a net and forced you to carry a backpack for the rest of your life. And that's impactful. We only take impactful measures of that magnitude when it can have significant, broader, positive impact on the species as a whole. So essentially, each monarch that we tag then becomes an ambassador for the betterment of its species. And then within the protocol, it is up to us as ethical scientists to ensure that we are doing no harm, because impact and harm are not the same things. So it can be very misleading when you see or hear about or read about efforts like this where we are doing things to wildlife. But we're trained individuals who know how to do so safely and ethically, and that doesn't necessarily mean that all humans should be doing the exact same thing that the scientists are doing, if that makes sense. So context matters. We do this as safely and ethically as possible for the betterment of the species, and beyond that, build the habitat, they will come.
Exactly. And I think we'll end it there. There are a few more questions in the chat, but we will be saving the questions and the chat. And I did see that Diane pointed out, don't be mowing a giant field in late June. Be aware of grassland birds. I was thinking about like my little tiny backyard plot patch. So yeah, be aware of nesting grassland birds there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But thank you all for your time this evening and your interest in this topic. Thank you, Lindsay, for an amazing presentation and a great Q&A afterwards.
My pleasure.
Huge shout out to all the partners out there that help spread the word. And again, when we send this link out next week or so with a link to the recording, please do feel free to share this within your networks, get more people aware of what we're doing here and how they can help both in their backyard and with their cell phone.
And in addition to sending the webinar recording once it's available, I will also make sure that all of the links that were in the presentation in the form of QR codes are also available. So all of that will be at your fingertips. And if you have follow-up questions or things that we didn't have the opportunity to answer here, you've got my email. You know how to reach New Hampshire Audubon. Ask us anytime, and we will be more than happy to continue this conversation.
Awesome. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Mark. Have a good one.
Take care.
Bye, folks.